did that relatively long commute. I lived in a wonderful house on Camac Street. Do any of you know that tiny little street? So sadly, this trip, I don't have enough time to go do a wander down memory lane, but I often do when I come back to the city. So I want to thank the graduate guides for making it possible for me to come back and also to see the wonderful reinstallation of your Chinese galleries. I had a little bit of time this morning, and I'm hoping to have a little bit of time this afternoon. But congratulations to PMA and Hiromi on that, and this sort of the long lingering celebration of your galleries. So it's wonderful to be here. I have been asked to speak to this existential question, what is Chinese? And I'm not sure that I actually have an answer to that question to share with you. I think Hiromi and I can maybe explore it a little bit more in our conversation later this morning. But I did want to share with you a number of things that I think beg this question, that are fundamentally transcultural objects of hybridity that don't easily fit into the box of what is Chinese art. And I thought I might start with this object because it has a wonderful history right here in Philadelphia. I think this is an image familiar to all of you, although I was thinking, in addition to Gilbert Stuart's Athenaeum portrait, I was going to say, and it's of course familiar to all of us for the dollar bills in our wallet, but for me, I never have dollar bills in my wallet anymore, so I don't know what the youth of tomorrow will think of when they see this. But certainly very much based on Gilbert Stuart's quintessential portrait of America's first president. But you might be surprised to know that this was painted in China. A very enterprising Philadelphian, John Sword, brought out with him, he was an American China trader in the very early years of Americans' direct engagement with China. And when he went out to Guangzhou, to Canton, in 1801, he brought with him a Gilbert Stuart oil of Washington. And he had 100 copies made in reverse painting on glass. This is one of those, and 100 in oil on canvas. And as with so many things being made in China at this point, he brought them back home with him and sold them to great profit here in Philadelphia, so much so that Gilbert Stuart sued him in the Philadelphia courts for an early form of copyright infringement, and actually Stuart won. So I think, at least from an 1801 perspective, this is not Chinese art, this is fraud. But I think certainly, nevertheless, I think a wonderful example of this cross-cultural exchange. And I think the medium here, this is not a medium unique to China, this is reverse painting on glass, and certainly there are a number of things in your American galleries, in your European galleries, that also demonstrate this really fascinating technique. But I'm quite fond of Chinese export reverse paintings on glass. There's a liquid lusciousness to them, and technically they're also quite fascinating. This is an entire pane of glass, interestingly imported from Europe, onto which the verso, the back side of this pane of glass, has been very carefully painted. And the thing that I particularly find exciting about it is the artist has had to think in reverse. So you are painting all the finest details of a composition prior to painting the background. But one of many examples of this, but I think he, and it most likely was a he who painted this in Guangzhou, did quite a lot of justice to Gilbert Stuart. So where was this painted? This was painted in the port city of Guangzhou, a city we often call Canton, which for over 100 years was the only place that by imperial decree foreigners could trade with China. So it was an incredibly controlled environment, and here you see a view of the foreign factories or hongs along the Pearl River. This is outside of the city walls, the city walls of the city of Guangzhou proper. So these foreigners are not even allowed into the city of Guangzhou. They're in these Western-style buildings along the Pearl River, an incredibly confined space, 1,000 yards long along the river, 300 yards deep, with these Western-style facades, but fundamentally these are Chinese buildings. And these are the spaces in which all foreigners both lived and worked throughout their entire time in China. So certainly an incredibly confining, claustrophobic space, but to my mind, this was also one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world in 1800, because you have Chinese merchants, you have merchants from all of the European trading nations who are engaged with China, and after 1784, we upstart Americans are nudging our way in there. You also have Parsi merchants, really people from all over the world are congregating in this space, and of course they're there to make enormous sums of money, which indeed many, many people did. This is one of many, many views of Guangzhou, and I think PMA also has wonderful views of this scene. This is singular in that it is the largest view of Guangzhou ever painted by Chinese artists, because it is a panorama on a set of wallpaper. So this is part of 18 panels of wallpaper that once hung on the walls of this castle, Strathallan Castle, outside of Perth in cold and rainy Scotland. The wallpaper hung on the walls of this castle for 175 years before the Peabody Essex Museum acquired it. And I was very interested to see where it had lived most of its life. Obviously painted in China, but a long history in Scotland. And I kept writing and writing and writing, calling the castle to no avail. So finally, a couple of years ago, I showed up with a roommate of mine who happens to be Scottish and live about 20 minutes away, and my, at that point, 3-year-old daughter. And with the combination of the local, charming Scottish woman and the small child, I managed to wheedle my way into the front door and see the room in which this hung. And you can see, I think, perhaps why they were not returning my calls, because of the chaos that this room, and of course that's why it was taken off the walls, but really quite devastating dry rot in this space. This is a rendering of how we will be installing the wallpaper in the new building, which opens, as Linnea said, September 28th. So I hope you will all come visit me this fall, although avoid October. For those of you who've ever been in Salem, we are the witch capital of the world. So I say come in late September or come in November, because October is terrible. But here we have what will be not a period room, but an immersive environment for the interpreting of this paper. And I just want to also then point to the view beyond this room will lead to a work of art that I think really does beg this question: what is Chinese? A monumental oil painting done in Guangzhou at about the same time as this reverse painting on glass and the wallpaper. But this is an oil on canvas, which is not a material that Chinese artists would have typically been using for domestic consumption. So very much being made for foreign merchants coming to China. But it also aesthetically is a wonderful cultural hybrid, in the sense that we have clouds over here on the right that are very evocative of European landscape painting. But I think you have a reminiscent of Chinese scroll painting with the mountains in the view on the left. The composition is fascinating in that it's this wonderful zigzag pattern that depicts all the steps for the production of tea. So we have tilling the fields, planting the bushes, watering bushes, picking tea leaves, and this zigzag continues, sorting tea leaves over the bridge to one of my favorite details, these 4 guys with their shirts off who are roasting tea. And then the zigzag continues down through the composition to what, to my mind, is the ultimate moment of this narrative, the negotiations between a Chinese Hong merchant and a Western merchant for the purchase of tea. When we think about the luxuries that were coming from China, we think about porcelain and silk and lacquer. But of course, tea really was the economic driver for all of this trade, but it got consumed, so we don't necessarily have it to share. Once their negotiations were completed, these tea crates would get loaded onto sampan boats, these watermelon-shaped boats, and then here the zigzag continues in this Chinese composition down the Pearl River to Whampoa, Huangpu, and this is the port where all foreign vessels docked while they were trading with China. So even though I'm saying that Guangzhou is this incredibly confined place, the only people who get to Guangzhou are the captain and the supercargo, the business manager of these voyages. The rest of the crew has to still hang out here in Whampoa. Perhaps they get maybe one day of shopping during their time. But very, very controlled. And of course, this imperial control is about not having these foreigners negatively impact the wider Chinese populations. So once all of these luxuries are packed up, of course, then the ships sail off to Europe or the Americas to make these vast fortunes. I just wanted to show you a few closer details of Canton of Guangzhou, a view much closer to the facades of these buildings. And on the right, a work that is not in the Peabody Essex Museum, sadly, although it's in a very good home in Hong Kong. A very rare view of the interiors of these buildings. We have almost no views of what the insides of these buildings looked like. But here, the room that was occupied by John Reeves, who was a British East India Company officer, a tea merchant, and he is perhaps best known now for his important role in the dissemination of information about Chinese botany. But you might be hard-pressed to identify this as a room in China, because it's, of course, entirely filled with English or American style buildings. I mean, perhaps maybe these rattan chairs, but we have, English looking table, English looking desk, English looking standing desk, wonderful little couch with ticking on it. As you can imagine, it doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense to import all this furniture from London or Philadelphia or Salem. So there was a whole group of craftsmen who developed in Guangzhou specifically to provide furniture like this. And here is a wonderful view done by a Chinese artist in watercolor on paper, showing some of the many craftsmen who are creating these Western style pieces of furniture in Guangzhou. Two guys, I think, who are mostly sort of overseeing and selling, somebody who's crating up furniture, and then this wonderful detail of a Chinese craftsman making a very American-looking recamier. And here a detail on the left, and on the right, an example that is in the Danvers Historical Society in Massachusetts that descended in the Crown and Shield family, one of Salem's big early families who were heavily engaged in trade. And much of this looks like an American example that one might see, and yet I hope it's a little bit difficult, but you might be able to make out, we have a wonderful dragon's head at the bottom of this recamier. So here, the Chinese craftsman is certainly replicating the form of a Western-style piece of furniture, but the ornamentation is distinctly Chinese. I'm so excited that Hiromi put my favorite piece of Chinese export furniture in the entire world into the gallery. It was really wonderful to revisit this again this morning. And have most of you seen this cabinet? So this is a wonderful piece of Chinese furniture made for a foreigner, made for this man, Andreas Everardus van Bram Hoogheest, whose name is always very fun to say, Andreas Everardus van Bram Hoogheest. And he has a fascinating history. This is his a portrait he had done of himself in unfired clay by a Chinese sculptor when he was in Guangzhou. He went out to China initially as a member of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and in fact was on an early Dutch embassy to Beijing. But once he sort of concluded his time in China for the VOC, he emigrated to South Carolina, where he set up plantations for rice production. And I think perhaps having seen rice production being done in China, he was hoping to transfer that to South Carolina. And things were going reasonably well for him until almost his entire family was killed with a scarlet fever epidemic. And I think in his grief, he went back out to China for a second time, made another fortune, and then ultimately came back to the United States but settled here in Philadelphia and built an extraordinary house called China's Retreat on the Schuylkill River. And he was clearly a voracious collector. He had assembled enormous quantities of all different kinds of Chinese art, Chinese porcelain and furniture clearly, but paintings. And he also brought with him many of the Chinese servants with whom he had lived for many years in Guangzhou. And to many people's minds, because von Braun made these collections accessible widely here in Philadelphia, this in many cases is regarded as the first display of Chinese art, public display of Chinese art in America. So it's wonderful that you have this cabinet on display. I just wanted to walk through, certainly we know through its provenance that it was von Braun's, but he clearly had the Chinese craftsmen who built this for him leave nothing to chance. This is a wonderful inset lacquer medallion with his monogram on it, and this is great detail to make out sort of the wonderful low relief carving here on these botanical motifs in the center of the cracked ice door on this probably bookcase, really, cabinet. But it's also this wonderful combination of sort of European forms, this very sort of neoclassical European style cornice, but the joinery on here is entirely Chinese and quite beautifully done. If you look on the side of the cabinet, you can see some very beautiful details of Chinese Throughtenons. Another thing I love about this cabinet is one of sort of these dentils up in the cornice is a secret latch for a compartment in the cornice that of course is not normally accessible, and who knows what von Braun was putting in this in China or in Philadelphia. And just in case we have any question about whose it was, von Braun ultimately went bankrupt, and the majority of his estate was sold at auction. And here we have somebody who acquired this, knowing that this association with von Braun was important and significant. He was a known quantity. So the purchaser of this has put a label on the inside of that secret compartment. Just going back to these other wonderful lozenges with a Buddha citron and a leaf. They're open now, but I suspect when von Braun commissioned them, they would have had reverse paintings on glass. Not necessarily Western style like the Gilbert Stuart, but very much done in the same techniques. I also wanted to draw your attention to this wonderful low relief carving, this strap carving, that is very similar to things we see on what we would regard more typically as Chinese domestic furniture. Von Braun, as I said, so he was a voracious collector, and clearly he was commissioning a lot of things. This is another chair, another piece of furniture commissioned by von Braun by these Cantonese cabinet makers. The form of this is very Western, very European or American style chair. And he's specifically asked that his monogram be also incorporated in low relief carving here. Here too, the joinery is not typical of what we would see in a Dutch or English or an American style chair. This is now with a small group of things associated with Van Braam now at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, so you can go see it on your next trip to Amsterdam. But I wanted, before we look at sort of other varieties of Chinese things, wanted to say that this hybridity, this transcultural exchange is not unique to China. This is happening all over the world, and certainly all over Asia during this period. Two chairs that are very similar in form to Van Braam's chair. The one on the left is done in solid ivory. This was done by carvers in Murshidabad in India. And on the right is an unknown origin chair. I think this was acquired perhaps as Chinese or South Asian, but it is very similar but not identical. And I often like to show it because I figure at some point someone is going to tell me where it was made. And what's unusual about this is the inlay, which is brass and copper and mother of pearl. So if you have any thoughts, I would be delighted to hear them. I wanted to shift our attention backwards about 200 years and just talk a little bit about the work we did for the exhibition Asia in Amsterdam. As Linnea mentioned, this is a show that the Peabody Essex Museum co-organized with the Rijksmuseum in 2016. And our goal for the show was really to explore the profound impact that Asia had on art and life in the Netherlands in the 17th century. And I think one of the works in the show that spoke most deeply to me on this subject, the profound impact that Asia and Dutch engagement with Asia had on the Netherlands, is this Jan van de Velde painting in a Dutch collection. And as with all still lifes, what seems haphazard and random, of course, never is. It's all very carefully constructed. And if you look at this sort of casually fallen over pewter tankard, wonderfully rendered. Look at how the paint has captured the light off of that pewter. And the lid is open here, and I have a detail here, haphazardly open. And we look on the inside of the lid is the seal of the city of Amsterdam. And of course, this is almost at the very center of this composition. And directly below that is a Chinese porcelain plate, maybe 1610, 1620, and on the bottom of the inside of that plate is entirely covered with pepper. And pepper was for the Dutch in the 17th century what tea was for the British and the Americans in the 18th and 19th century. This was the economic driver for trade with Asia. And I think the fact that Van de Velde has put these three things at the center of the composition speaks to the really incredibly important role that Dutch engagement with Asia had, certainly on the economic vibrancy. And some have argued that the golden age was golden in part because of all of the profit from Asia, but also its impact on the artistic and cultural life in the Netherlands in this period. And I also wanted to share with you this wonderful Bergheide painting of the Herengracht, one of the fanciest canals in Amsterdam, even now, one of the fanciest canals. And certainly in 1650, this was 680 Park Avenue. This was as expensive as you get in terms of real estate in 17th century Amsterdam. And what I particularly love about this painting is that this is Boomtown. This is Amsterdam becoming great right before our eyes. All of these washes of light are empty lots on which canal houses have not yet been built. And in fact, if you look in the back, you can literally see it is a construction site. They are on the move, and they are building many of these canal houses with the profits from trade with Asia. We as a team also like to talk about the fact that there would have been Asian art, Asian commodities in every room in this house. And we used a number of things to support that assertion, certainly one being the contents of trash pits, which are always exciting to see what comes up in. This is the contents of a late 17th century trash pit from a couple canals over. But here you see lots of things of local production, European glassware, German stoneware, locally produced earthen redware, a small quantity of Chinese teawares, but then also quite a lot of tin-glazed earthenware, what we call Delftware these days. And I definitely do want to touch on that more. But before I do that, I also want to talk about what's happening in the way in which these Asian imports are impacting the interiors of many of these houses. Here, a wonderful painting that's in Geneva now from the early 17th century that is a wonderful survivor that records the way in which these ceramics were displayed in houses. This is a prosperous middle-class household, and they have 31 pieces of Chinese porcelain on display here. And I think I just want to take a survey. Who in this room has ceramics on display in your home? Yes. And why are we doing that? Because I think we all do. Although I will say, if I ask that to a really young audience, they have not yet gotten the bug, but we're working on them. We're all doing this because they started doing this. This is a new phenomenon that people of the broad spectrum of society are displaying ceramics decoratively. These certainly would also have been used, but they were fundamentally being something new from a decorative perspective. And what begins here goes to new heights later. So we certainly have evidence from trash pits, we have evidence from paintings. My favorite source of evidence on the way that Asian luxuries are being incorporated into Dutch households are things like this, these very large-scale dolls' houses, which were never meant to be played by children. They were the plaything of very wealthy adult women. And I just wanted to show you a detail of the best kitchen, the Prunk kitchen, with all of these miniatures of Chinese and Japanese porcelain, some of which are even being made in Asia specifically for these purposes. But in terms of Chinese porcelain, what is Chinese? What is made for domestic consumption? What is made for export? And I always love to look at these two plates from Pem's collection. You have a very similar charger in the galleries across the way. And this is a plate, and the potter who made this plate had painted this scene hundreds, if not thousands of times before. These peonies, the fluid lines, the wonderful ease with which this design has been added in cobalt under the glaze to this piece. What's happening over here is fascinating, but it's maybe not as aesthetically pleasing. Would you not agree? It's a little clunky. And of course, this is because the artists who are painting this in Jingdezhen, the ceramics capital of the world even now, are really for the very first time trying to incorporate European motifs. And here we have the mark of the Augustinians, a double-headed eagle with a pierced heart, which looks nothing like a pierced heart. And these blobby things we think are supposed to represent the fortified monasteries in Mexico. So the potters are really struggling with how to incorporate these foreign motifs. They get much better very quickly, but here showing how hard that is. The potters in Jingdezhen are also incorporating foreign forms. So here we have a salt cellar that's being made in Jingdezhen after probably a wooden model sent by the VOC. And here you have the silver example that would have been the original source for that. And then here, just getting to Delft, where a crockware plate, crockware refers to these segmented borders around the edges of a plate. This made in Jingdezhen in about 1610, 1620, and more than 60 years later, very similar motifs being done on tin-glazed earthenware in Delft by a prominent Delft potter, but you see that segmentation happening here as well. The Delftware potters are also incorporating motifs that would be very unfamiliar to the Chinese potters at Jingdezhen, but to the Dutch very much spoke to Asia. On the left is the frontispiece of one of a big bestseller in the 17th century, Johann Nieuwhof's publication on the 17th century Dutch embassy to Beijing. And really, many people's impressions of China throughout Europe were based on the multiple versions of this publication in many different languages. And here we see the Delftware potters have transferred that frontispiece onto a covered vase that is very much, the form of it is very Chinese, and yet no Chinese potter would have recognized those motifs as having anything to do with China. Here, how far would you go to get what you want? And many, many of these Europeans went very, very far. But I would say nobody went as far as this crazy, crazy man. Augustus the Strong, who was Elector of Saxony, king in Poland, and he was completely obsessed with Asian ceramics. He assembled arguably the largest collection in Europe in the early 18th century. He had at one point over 30,000 pieces of Chinese and Japanese porcelains. He's perhaps most celebrated for things like this. This is a 3-foot-high vase made in Jingdezhen. And Augustus traded an entire regiment of mercenary soldiers for 18 of these vases. And I like to think that those mercenary soldiers had no idea what was on the other end of the exchange, because I think that might have been a little bit demoralizing. But Augustus definitely liked his ceramics so much that he really spearheaded the production of the first true hard paste porcelain in Europe at Meissen. This is not Augustus's display, but this is the display of porcelain at Charlottenburg, and Augustus saw this relatively early in his life, and that really spurred him to kind of go one beyond. But here you see a very similar kind of so-called soldier vase in Charlottenburg. I just wanted to touch on armorial porcelain slightly, because certainly this is this wonderful hybrid of ceramics being made in China, very much incorporating European motifs, and everybody who was anybody in the 18th century had a service of Chinese export armorial porcelain. Very few of them have remained together as sets. We've been collecting them like stamps for a very long time. And this is a piece from Pem's collection that is from the largest service ever made, the Oakover, or the most elaborate service ever made, the Oakover service. And the Oakover family took nothing to chance. They commissioned a watercolor from a known English artist, Arthur Devis, and they had Devis paint every last detail of this so that there would be no confusion. Because as you can imagine, very often these communications that happen over thousands of miles over many, many months is a little bit of an 18th century game of telephone. Things get mangled. And Oakover's service had no problems. By contrast, the family on the right, the Debris family, had big trouble, and clearly they had a very poor agent. They ordered 6 different services of Chinese porcelain, and only one of them came back completely correct. This is my favorite mistake, though. Typically, when you ordered your armorial porcelain, you would send out your book plate, your armorial book plate, black and white book plate that goes in the front cover of books. Most people would color in that book plate to tell the Chinese enamelers what the design was supposed to look like. The Debris were clearly not thinking, and they annotated their book plate. So I hope you can just make out, it says red here, red. And here says green. And I love the fact that those Chinese enamelers, they'd been doing this with some regularity for quite some time, and they knew these Europeans liked lots of different colors on their ceramics, and so they just went to town and came up with all different kinds of colors that clearly have nothing to do with what was supposed to be there. For them, of course, the Latin motto was as incomprehensible as these so-called instructions. Most people had armorial porcelain. Some people also purchased Chinese export lacquer that incorporated their own marks of their own family. This is a 12-fold lacquer screen in Pem's collection that was commissioned by Sir John Eccleston in about the 1720s. And the scenes on the front are fairly typical sort of palace scenes that we see on many screens made for use in China as well as for export. What's particularly unusual are these marks on the top. 10 of the panels have Sir John Eccleston's coat of arms, and here you see a detail of that. But I think what is also extraordinary is what is on the back. Did I mention he was a silk merchant in London, in Spitalfields? And of course, he's paying for this incredibly expensive object with a lot of the profits from imported silk. And I think just as much as he wanted his coat of arms on the front of this piece, he presumably asked to have scenes of rice production, but also silk production depicted on the back. And here we see women who are laying the warp threads in preparation for weaving, and here a woman in this building who is weaving silk on a loom. So a very personal object, I'm sure, for Eccleston. Silk, of course, is another commodity that is being imported in enormous quantities, sometimes very much proclaiming its Chineseness in the sense of the silk that was used to make this dress worn in New York in the 18th century. And you can see these lotus or peonies are very much speak to their Chinese origins. But there were other silks that were imported that other than the fact that you knew they were imported, spoke nothing of the craftsmen who made them. On the right, we see some papers in the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum, which are a buying guide for Benjamin Shreve, an American merchant who was going out to Canton. And these are silk samples that his predecessors acquired from this man, Ushing, a silk merchant, to help inform what was going to be the best sellers in Salem in 1816. And I think if we would look at if we had large-scale pieces of any of these silks, it would be very difficult to identify these specifically as Chinese manufacture. And I just also wanted, this is another one of my favorites. This is sort of the trifecta of wonderfulness in terms of objects. This is a Chinese export painting done in oil on canvas by a known artist, Spoilum, one of the earliest artists working in Guangzhou in a Western style. It's of a known sitter, Ushing, this silk merchant working in Guangzhou very extensively with American and European merchants. And of course, then we have the silk samples from Ushing, but it also has survived in its original Chinese export frame. And I just go back to our earlier conversations about all of these craftsmen in Guangzhou who are making things that don't necessarily look like Chinese furniture. This looks like an English or American frame. And yet, once again, the construction is entirely different than we would have seen. And before I go to the next slide, I just also want to point out, because I think we'll talk a little bit about it when Hiromi and I talk, these large numbers, 387. This is from an 1821 guide to what was then the East India Marine Society's collections, the origin organization for whom I work. And our collections have been accessible to the public since 1799, and very much about exploring the world for the people of Salem. So the trifecta, in the sense that it's one of the earliest Chinese objects to come into the collection. And I just also wanted to show you this watercolor from a set of 100 of Chinese craftsmen, of Cantonese craftsmen. And here we see a cabinet maker specifically making these Western style frames. I keep mentioning the joinery, and here are two examples that show these wonderful through-tenon joints that are incredibly durable joints and incredibly beautiful joints, but not typically what we'd be seeing. We wouldn't see these used in the same way that they are. And when you're back in the Chinese galleries, if you look on the side of the von Brahms cabinet, you'll see these wonderful through-tenons coming through. And here just a detail of a sideboard from Amsterdam that has that is betraying its betraying its Chinese origins with these through-tenons on the front. And then I just wanted to conclude with another object very specifically associated with Philadelphia, this wonderful moon bed, which has been in the Peabody Essex Museum's collection since the 1970s. But it came first to Philadelphia and was part of the displays at the Philadelphia Centennial. We did not initially know that. We actually, it was given to us by Robert Sarnoff, who was the head of RCA. I think he had used it as a bed, but it had been in Hollywood in the mid 20th century, and actually shows up as a prop in a lot of films for sort of Chinese interiors. So we knew it was an extraordinary work of art, and we knew it was probably made in the mid to late 19th century in Ningbo, a center for cabinet making that is specifically known often for these inlaid ivory and other woods. But we didn't have any history, and my predecessor, Bill Sargent, collects stereopticon views, among many other things, and he happened to be going through a box of stereopticons and, of course, found this stereopticon, which then completely and wonderfully expanded our understanding of what this object was. Here, a stereopticon at the Philadelphia Centennial, showing the bed, and interestingly, showing the bed without any of the textiles one would have assumed it would have been dressed with in China. And indeed, I think one wonders if it was painted silk that got wet on the journey, and so then they opted to just display it without anything. But that's now how we also display it. And I think I probably am out of time. But we can continue to talk more about that, and maybe we'll leave the Philadelphia Centennial object up. Hiromi, do you want to join me up here?